Economists, this is Miss Haley, and welcome back to AP Macro Flip Videos. So last week we mastered the understanding of aggregate supply and aggregate demand, and also attached this idea of certain fiscal policy tools. So this week we're going to talk about what the heck is actual fiscal policy, how do we define different types of fiscal policy, and why do governments use fiscal policy to stabilize their economies. So what this week I'm kind of excited for this. Instead of having a traditional summative, we all are going to be prepping and preparing for debates about how a nation can use fiscal policy to combat stagflation. And so you all will be assigned different perspectives on this issue, and we're going to delve into it more in this video, but just know for right now that stagflation is a combination of high unemployment and inflation. So what is fiscal policy and who implements it? So fiscal has to do with government revenue and government taxes, and policy has to do with a kind of strategy or action that's adopted or proposed by an individual group. So fiscal policy is the government proposing a change in spending, a change in taxes, change in their budget tools to influence the whole economy of a nation. And so that's usually through aggregate demand. So discretionary versus non-discretionary has to do with who has the freedom or who is driving the change. So non-discretionary fiscal policy means that it's already in place, that's already set by some sort of legislation that was priorly presented and discussed and voted. And so this would be an automatic stabilizer of the economy, and it's not a decision made at that moment by the government. Versus discretionary fiscal policy is the government realizing we see extreme recession, we see extreme inflation, and so we want to present new legislation that will then later become non-discretionary fiscal policy. That it's a non-mandatory change, but the government sees there to be a reason for them to use their discretion or their decision making to influence new fiscal policy. So from non-discretionary or discretionary fiscal policy, we have these two types of either expansionary fiscal policy and contractionary fiscal policy. So we're going to look at the visual of those two types right now. So expansionary fiscal policy, again, has to do with increasing aggregate demand. And we know aggregate demand is represented by SIGNIC. So what the government could do is increase their government spending, so the G of SIGNICs, and that would increase not just price levels, but the main thing that we're trying to counteract as a government right now is this unemployment, because we remember that long-run aggregate supply represents full unemployment and the highest potential output of that nation. So if currently the government sees that there is unemployment, that the nation is not actually producing the full potential of output, that they want to counteract this unemployment and increase government spending. The government for expansionary fiscal policies could also decrease taxes, which remember that would give each consumer more disposable income, so they would increase the C of SIGNICs. So increasing government spending, decreasing taxes are both expansionary fiscal policy that would lead to less unemployment. So contractionary fiscal policy, this is the opposite. So we're saying we want to contract, we want to decrease the economic growth just for a period of time. And so the goal of contractionary fiscal policy would be shifting the aggregate demand to the left. So that would mean that there would be a decrease in consumer spending and there would be a decrease in government spending. How does that happen? So the government could just say we want to spend less money on certain projects, but they would also increase taxes, so consumers would have less disposable income to be spending. So contractionary fiscal policy is typically trying to counteract rising price levels. And so with a lower quantity of output, there would be lower price levels, so less inflation. So remember, we want to connect our visualization of expansionary and contractionary fiscal policy to the tools of fiscal policy we already took last week. And so this idea that income increasing, so the government spending more money, it actually has a ripple effect throughout the whole economy, that consumption also increases. And we as economists can measure how much there is potentially going to be an increase in spending by looking at the nation's marginal propensity to consume. So that portion of the income that's going to be spent, and so then that's going to decide how much of the total impact on spending from initial change of a given amount will we see. From the government increasing their spending by 100 billion, how much of that 100 billion will then be spent by each individual, and how will that show us a larger sum change of spending? So let's review over here. So in this situation, the government passes new legislation to increase salaries by 1 billion, and the marginal propensity to consume, so the portion of that new income that's going to be spent, is 0.75. And so in this graphic, we see each of those rounds of new spending occurring, that we would take the marginal propensity to consume and multiply it by that original amount, and then next amount and next amount. And we recall that if we wanted to just find the sum instead of looking at all these individual transactions, we would take 1 divided by 1 minus marginal propensity to consume to find the spending multiplier, which is 4. And so we would take that initial spending of 1 billion, multiply it by 4, and get $400 billion of new spending in this economy. So questions that would assess our understanding from this video: what type of fiscal policy is present, discretionary or non-discretionary? And is this expansionary or contractionary fiscal policy? So to answer these questions, we see in the question they're saying that the government is passing new legislation, that this isn't already an automatic stabilizer that's present in the government or in the economy, that the government is passing something new. They're realizing that there might be a recession and we really want to increase spending. So this would be actually a discretionary fiscal policy. And then is this expansionary or contractionary? If we're seeing an increase in aggregate demand that's coming by increased government spending, and now there's also increased consumers' ability to spend money, they have a larger dispensable income, that we're seeing an expansionary fiscal policy. And now let's also check in about our good friend stagflation. And so remember, we said that stagflation has to do with inflation as well as unemployment. How do we see both of these on this graph? And so we can see that there is unemployment because the quantity of real GDP is less than the long-run aggregate supply. Simple. The quantity here is less than the quantity of full employment, and so we see there's unemployment. And so we might think initially, oh, we want to use expansionary fiscal policy because when we have unemployment, we have cyclical unemployment, we're in a recession, so we want to increase economic activity. Not always. How do we also see inflation in this graph? And so because we've seen rising, let's say they're just rising input prices, there is an increase in price level. And so with an increase in price level, we also have inflation. So if this government inputted the expansionary fiscal policy, would actually see an increasing rise in that price level. So the question that we are going to discuss is, how can a government use fiscal policy? How can they counteract unemployment and inflation without exacerbating one of the two? And so one solution that economists proposed in the 70s, which definitely has many different political sides to it and political perspectives to it, is the supply side fiscal policy. So instead of influencing aggregate demand increasing or decreasing, this solution is saying that we want to change the actual full employment of a nation. We want to change that full employment output level. And so supply-side fiscal policy is still using government spending and taxes to influence change, but now it's going to be influencing the productivity of different companies and changing the actual amount of money that companies have to produce more or less of items. So we're going to delve more into these examples this week, but just looking at one specific example. If research and development taxes are giving more credits, and so this would be if a company is researching a new type of computer software, or if they're developing a new way to make their products more productively, they would actually have to pay less taxes. So this would lead to an increase in production, increase in total production. So this would see a shift to the right of the aggregate supply. And so we'll start to see about how this change in supply side fiscal policy was a proposed solution to stagflation. And so let's look at, why are we even discussing expansionary, contractionary, and supply side fiscal policy? What is the goal that governments and nations think they can achieve with fiscal policy? And so many countries have a goal of increased economic growth, which means that over multiple business cycles, over time, we see an increase in real GDP. And so economists argue that, some economists argue that without countercyclical fiscal policy, or without fiscal policy by the government that's trying to counteract the business cycle, we have extreme peaks and troughs, so extreme levels of inflation and recession. So economists argue that with fiscal policy, you can avoid those high peaks of inflation and those low troughs of unemployment and become a nation that increases their economic growth while also having a smooth business cycle. That there's really more of an upward trajectory and less extremes of inflation and recession. And so, what each of your groups will be challenged to do this week is, can this smooth business cycle be actually achieved, especially in the situation of stagflation? So, thank you all and enjoy the rest of your day.